Hi, my name's Reese, and perhaps we'll change the pace a little bit and talk about the future of blockchain and in a way that you might find useful to predict it on your own. And that the basic premise is that blockchain is like genetics, it's like biology, it's like DNA. And the way DNA evolved will help you anticipate how blockchain and the different kinds of blockchains will likely evolve in the future. And so the future doesn't repeat itself from history, it rhymes or it echoes. So it's not a precise copy of the past, it's something that some of the things from the past can be learned to predict what's likely to happen in the future, but it's likely to be subtly different in various ways as you'll see. And so what's carried in blockchain is information, and that's what's carried in DNA and genetics. And my human genome, or each of our human genomes, is about 1.5 gigabyte of digital storage. It's 6 billion letters, 3 billion base pairs in our DNA. That is essentially our genetics. And blockchain or Bitcoin's blockchain was about that size in 2012. And since then, it has been increasing in size, and it has a mechanism that records a ledger of every single transaction that's happened since Satoshi Nakamoto's Genesis block. And it continues to grow in an exponential way, but by a mathematical format that's approximately every 10 minutes, a new block is written to the blockchain of the transactions that have happened in the recent 10 minutes. And this is done by miners using an algorithm that keeps it at about 10 minutes. So if the time is getting too long, the algorithm gets simpler, so it's faster. And if this time is going too fast, the algorithm gets more complicated. So it follows a relatively smooth curve. And as you can see on the graph on the left, it's been growing to the 150 gigabytes that it is now for a full node of the whole ledger. And the mathematical algorithm, the chart on the right, is showing where it will continue to grow through essentially 2140, which is when all of the Bitcoins possible will have been mined. And so it'll cross about 1 terabyte of size in about 2022, or the end of 2022. And so this is substantially larger than the genomes of any particular kind of creature, and way larger than the information that's carried in a human genome. And so this is kind of a new kind of information store or flow that replicates with the quality and speed and reliability of computers, and is actually better at replicating information than DNA and genetics. And so what is blockchain? And I'm sure you've heard these kind of stories, but it's a system that people volunteer, like all the parties participating volunteer to participate in this algorithm and this peer way of transferring information. And it's borderless in that it operates independent of country. It's decentralized in that there isn't a central computer of blockchain. It's distributed in that the mining nodes are all over the world. There's thousands of them. And if one of them fails, the others pick up the slack. And so it will persist to replicate even if some of the components fail. So in that way, it's like the internet. And it's a replicating system in that it's, with each block that's written, it's repeating all of the prior blocks in the ledger. So it's actually a lot of data to replicate just to record some new information. And then it's a framework for how does this happen, how does the information flow, and how is it stored, and then a protocol for how it's replicated and changed over time. So what other things are kind of like that? Well, I would suggest that genetics and DNA is very much like that in all of these categories. And it's the original gangster of a decentralized, distributed, peer-to-peer replicating system, that there isn't a president of genetics, there isn't a president of blockchain or a president of the internet. It's decentralized, and that it happens in a distributed way where creatures replicating in Australia are independent of creatures replicating in Norway, and blockchain is much the same way in that, but blockchain reconciles all of its information worldwide in its current Bitcoin form anyway, and Ethereum as well. And so some of the characteristics of genetics are actually very similar to the characteristics of a distributed blockchain, unlike the way information replicates through banking and centralized databases and regular sort of information stores. And so other aspects of the information replication is there's the ledger, of course, and how does this replicate reliably at scale? And this is both from algorithms and the fact that it's distributed, in that there's not just one place that the information is being replicated. It's being replicated in parallel through many nodes of miners, and they come to a consensus agreement where if more than half of them agree on the most recent block, which also includes all the prior transactions, then it's recorded for posterity in a reliable way. And it's a mining mechanism that has a mathematical mechanism of trust, in that how you know that the current blockchain is valid is an algorithm from its hash code that you can rely on, that your transaction got entered, that all of the prior transactions are valid, and that the majority of the mining nodes agree that it's valid. And so you can trust it in some ways more than you could trust your government or your bank or a centralized database from a company, in that those kind of centralized systems can be modified at the center, and the trust in the authenticity of it is less than something that's been distributed across thousands of nodes, that if one of them were to modify it, the others would not agree that that modification was valid and reject it. And so what you're actually trusting is the consensus of many nodes and not just a single database. And then there's the speed of how fast this can happen. And Bitcoin's blockchain is relatively slow. It writes to the blockchain every 10 minutes. So if you're waiting to pay for your Starbucks coffee and it takes 10 minutes for that to happen, that'll be frustrating. So it's appropriate for some kinds of applications, but not every kind of application. And the speed also is a function of the amount of energy that it takes, and we'll touch on that a little bit in how that's a problem and a benefit from a trust and security point of view. And so DNA has these, and genetics has these same characteristics, and some deficiencies relative to blockchain, where it's kind of a ledger of information, and the biochemical reliability of copying DNA has an error rate. It's not perfect. And so the error rate is roughly 10 billion, 1 in 10 billion times the machinery of replicating DNA makes a mistake. And so that is something that limits the amount of information that can be replicated and carried in DNA. And it's a protocol that's adaptive in that the way information is copied, it's checked to make sure that it's accurate and the same as what it's copying from. And it's a parallel system that works in a distributed, decentralized way with peer-to-peer replication. And so in that way, it's similar to blockchain. And then the efficiency of it is something that isn't perfect, where the energy for replicating DNA comes from either what you eat or photosynthesis. And this is somewhat of a limit that is evolves over time, where the types of information replication in DNA, if it's not relatively efficient, it's things that are more efficient survive and things that are inefficient go extinct. And so over billions of years, DNA and genetics has evolved a way to throw away information that blockchain still keeps, and to make a more efficient system that survives. And so where the energy comes from to replicate the DNA is, in the case of animals, is predation, where the animals eat other life forms in order to generate the biochemical energy to replicate themselves, whereas blockchain uses electricity in the mining systems to collect the energy to run the algorithms to replicate the information in a reliable way. And the graph in the center is the amount of compute power that's required to replicate the blockchain in a measure of petahashes. And as you can see, it's been going up extremely rapidly relative to other things, in that the amount of computations required to replicate a new block is getting more and more intensive. And even though there's custom chips now made for mining rigs that do this particular computation very rapidly, they still consume a lot of electricity. And the amount of electricity that Bitcoin's blockchain is consuming is growing somewhat similar to this chart, even with the efficiencies. And so eventually it will pass the amount of electricity that is used by humans for all other things if it continues on this path. And so that's a downside, and then it uses a lot of electricity. This can come from solar and other sources, but it's an inefficiency that maybe is not necessary for how Bitcoin's blockchain works today. And there are a number of efforts to use proof of stake or proof of space and time or other algorithms that are much more energy efficient is one way that this might change the dynamic. But they won't be Bitcoin's blockchain, they'll be something else, and like a new species. And so a blockchain, I would suggest, is like a species, like a bird or a fish or a plant. And Bitcoin's blockchain is one of those, but in the evolution, there will likely be many. And we'll talk about that more. But the efficiency is one of the main natural selection criterion of what survives and thrives and what gets constrained to a niche to operate or goes extinct. And so how information flows through life is similar to how it flows through blockchain, in that in life, the information comes from the parents in the form of DNA, and then the DNA is what's carried from generation to generation. And then as the creature metabolizes, the DNA, like the code in the DNA, is turned into RNA, which is turned into proteins and enzymes, which then is turned into the chemicals that is our metabolic life. And at the when an individual's life stops, this chain reaction stops, and the information is still in the genetics, and you can clone a deceased organism and restart it again. But the metabolism is a flow of information. It's not just a container of information. And so how does this work, or what is the equivalent of metabolism in blockchain? I would suggest that the blockchain is the information, and the metabolism of a particular blockchain, say Bitcoin's blockchain, is the token Bitcoin, and then the applications and organizations that are consuming or metabolizing that. And so there are now many different kinds of blockchains and many more kinds of tokens and applications and organizations that make use of them. And so an app that's built on the Ethereum blockchain, for example, is metabolizing differently than an app built on Bitcoin's blockchain. So this is similar to or parallel to how metabolism works in living things, where the information is in our genetics and the metabolism is what we eat and how that's turned into our life as it continues on. And a blockchain is like a species, and a species in biology has a particular pattern of genetic information. And so there's a phenomenon called speciation, where two different creatures evolve from a single one. Say donkeys and horses evolve from a common ancestor, and they have mostly the same information, but they start down different paths. And the equivalent to this in blockchain is forking, where the original information is replicated, and then you have two different species evolving with different apps and different tokens and different metabolism into different species that are have a common origin but are now different. And so what happens to these different species is they're subject to natural selection, just like in biology. And the ones that are the fit an environment or an application and a token that fits a particular function or niche in the ecosystem is more likely to survive and thrive better than the ones that don't have the mix of characteristics that you would want for it to survive. And there's natural ecosystems that are a combination of many different species. And so it's not just Bitcoin versus Ethereum versus many of the others. It's that they will all likely coexist in the blockchain equivalent of a rainforest, and which ones survive or not are based on that. And so what people do is they selectively breed these things and say, well, we want the particular kind of potato or corn or animal that we like to eat, and so we'll make more of them. And this is a monoculture, or breeding these things to be all the same. And so this is good in that you get more of what you want, but it's bad in that it creates a vulnerability where monoculture breeds essentially an environment that disease can very quickly wipe out a whole design. So if everybody were to standardize on Bitcoin's blockchain, it has a risk that maybe its energy inefficiency or how long it takes or some of the other characteristics could wipe it out in one step. And so what happens in biology is things diversify into many different kinds of species. With the tree of life, as many people have learned, there is the animals and the plants and the microbes and all the different creatures have a common origin, but they're essentially cousins of each other. And these bifurcations are one kind of speciation, and another is a mutation or a change where things that started out as the same species, when they evolve into something different, they're now different. They no longer can interbreed with their common origin. And so here's a more complicated graph of the tree of life, where there's the genesis block, or the original DNA species that is down at the bottom about 4 billion years ago, and then all the different species that have diverged since then. And so on this, from microbes on the left to plants in the middle to mammals on the right, everybody is cousins of each other, and that they're all different and they can't necessarily interbreed, and they each have different characteristics. But blockchain is likely to go through this same evolutionary path from the way it is now to many different versions than exist today. And which ones survive won't necessarily be predictable in advance. It's the ones that are the most adaptable to a changing environment. And so that changing ecosystem, of course, the climate is changing, the population is changing, food supplies are changing. And in blockchain, what people use it for is unpredictable in the future. And it's likely that ones that are dominant now won't necessarily be the dominant ones in the future, that there will likely be changes from different kinds of forces. And what happened in biology is there was a time about 500 million years ago, where there was a few different forms of life that all of a sudden exploded into millions of different forms of life, called the Cambrian explosion, where the life of all different types became more diversified. And this is likely to happen to blockchain. And that in the Cambrian explosion, there were a few types, maybe a few thousand, like there's a few thousand different kinds of blockchains and tokens now, and it went to millions of different species. So is this likely to happen to blockchain, where everybody has a token and everybody has a different version? It's quite likely if it follows the same path as biology. And so in the further future, the biochemical information store of life is extending. It's not changing, it's extending, where the genetics that makes up me is part of who I am. There's also my culture and what I learned and what I was taught growing up. And then it's extending beyond that, and that how much of myself have I put in the internet, and how much of me is in Facebook, and then how much of me is on the blockchain. And so there's a digital part of me and a biochemical part of me, and they both make up me, and they will survive for different amounts of time. So there's kind of a evolution of the complexity of life from simple biochemical to information plus biochemical. And so what makes up a person today is becoming more information and less biochemical. In that, still a mix of both, but we're more information than we are biochemical, and the information with the capabilities of blockchain is improving in terms of the vastness of the amount of information that can be carried over time, as well as the proportion that this digital information versus biochemical. And so this information flows across time, in that the chemicals in our body change on a regular basis over years, and that our memories, though, stay in our mind persistent, although the chemicals that are storing our memories are changing with our metabolism. And so there's an illusion that our memories are the same, but when you test memories subjectively, or quantitatively, you find that the memory that we think we had is actually different than what happened in most cases. And so this is a flow of information across time, with the substrate changing, where the chemicals that are our biochemistry are changing, but we perceive ourselves as being the same across time. And so in a sense, what our life is mostly information that is changing across time, in much the same way as, say, a wave goes across the ocean and then crashes on the beach, where the water in the ocean is not really moving sideways, just the wave is moving sideways, and the water goes up and down. And so in our life, moving across time, our perception of life is much more like a wave, and it's getting more complicated and more intricate with these digital forms. But in the end, our life is much more like a wave than it's like a particle in this wave-particle duality. So that's where I'll stop for any questions. Thank you very much. I can hear it. So you asked if the law of accelerating returns is related to the exponential change that Ray Kurzweil talks about. And I helped start Singularity University, so I'm very familiar with the details of this. And the law of accelerating returns is that there's an acceleration in the rate of change, or in change of information technologies in particular. And so things are getting faster, like your phone is getting twice as good every year, and the internet is getting better, and the computers are getting better. And so the ability to do things in digital information is accelerating. And so it is very related, and this is somewhat similar ideas.
If prior to blockchain, we had distributed databases, we had encryptography, encryption, we had networking, what was it about Bitcoin and blockchain? What was the one thing that made all of this possible? And if there was one thing, how does that one thing evolve over time and still produce the results of the original intent from the perspective of why it was created in the first place? You understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, understood. So for me, the blockchain is an evolution of internet protocols that before that there was file transfer protocol and simple mail protocol and these kind of things for moving information from one place to the next. And there have been mechanisms of saying when it's left me and gone to you, the information that I have is now tagged as old, and what you have is tagged as new and unique. And this is important for money, where if I send you $1, the dollar you have should work and the one I have should stop working. Otherwise, it's the double spend problem and it didn't transfer. And so blockchain specifically was designed for electronic money, or electronic cash.
What's the mechanism that enables the prevention of a double spend? And
so the main breakthrough of blockchain in Satoshi Nakamoto's implementation was an algorithm and a mining and a consensus that we both volunteer to participate in. We both agree that our transaction will be written into the system, and then a distributed network of computers tag that with a unique hash as a transaction, and then continue to validate that that transaction happened, it wasn't undone, and it's now history.
Would you agree that it's proof of work that enables?
Well, the mathematical mechanism that it uses is called proof of work, or is using proof of work. But proof of work, as I mentioned, is very energy and compute intensive and inefficient. And so it's...
So I guess what I would just say is that if it's proof of work, and we agree that it's proof of work, that is what's key in all this, how does proof of work itself evolve? That's where I was driving.
So proof...
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop Reese because we time for one more question, but I invite you to talk to Reese afterwards as soon as we're done and engage, because we might have... Do we have another question from the audience? Okay. All right, fine. Well, then we're going to go to the next session, but feel free to continue to talk to Reese. We have one more question over here. All right, thank you. Wait, can you wait for the mic? Wait for the mic.
Do you see Hashgraph as an evolution of blockchain? And if so, do you think it will be successful? Why or why not?
Yeah, so Hashgraph and proof of stake and proof of time and space and all kinds of other proof of storage, there's a whole bunch of algorithms that are evolving as different species of blockchains. And some will likely survive for certain niches, just like fish are better in the ocean and cacti are better in the desert. And so there's not likely to be one, there's likely to be many, and each ones will be better at different things, like more efficient, faster, more reliable, various characteristics of blockchain.